Isms at work in the 19th century. The rise of classical liberalism versus classical conservatism, and nationalism and unification movements in Europe. The reason why this lecture is called Isms at Work is because in the 19th century there are many different political ideologies that come about that end in ism. So we nickname all of them ism. Lecture terms. A byproduct of the Atlantic revolutions that were inspired by Enlightenment ideals is the birth of a new group of political isms that come about. Primarily, we're going to discuss classical liberalism versus classical conservatism in the first part of this lecture. So we're going to start with some basic definitions and explanations. First of all, classical liberalism, people who were classical liberals were generally proponents of Enlightenment ideals. These wide sweeping changes and progress based on reason that had been happening in the Atlantic revolutions were things that they thought should happen everywhere. And ultimately, these people that we refer to as classical liberals are basically the new torchbearers for the same Enlightenment ideals in the 19th century. By the time we get to the 19th century, it had been over a century since the beginning of the Enlightenment. The original Enlightenment philosophes were long gone by this point, and so these classical liberals become the new standard bearers for the same types of principles. The ideas that government should not be too large or overreaching, that human reason should be utilized to try to make society better, and to try to make the government more fair based on the needs of the people. So classical liberals are basically the 19th century Enlightenment thinkers. They just are called classical liberals because the Enlightenment philosophes were a century before them. Now, there are a couple of important individuals that you need to know when it comes to, I guess you would call them the poster children of the classical liberal movement of the 19th century. These folks would be like the John Locke and the Montesquieu of the Enlightenment. We have Jeremy Bentham and we have John Stuart Mill. Jeremy Bentham was a member of the English House of Commons, which means he was elected to that position in government in the constitutional monarchy that England had. He will be in Parliament in the early 19th century, and having been a proponent of the Enlightenment ideals, been engrossed in the Enlightenment ideals of Locke and others his entire life, he brought that with him to his governmental position. Ultimately, he fosters a new movement based on these Enlightenment principles known as utilitarianism. Bentham thought, as an elected official, that it was his job, as well as the rest of the government's job, to look after the natural rights of the people of England. And he came up with this notion of utilitarianism to try to gauge if a new law was a good law, but also to see if previous laws that had been passed were good laws. Utilitarianism basically was a litmus test for laws. If they promoted the greatest good for the greatest number, then they were good laws. If they did not promote the greatest good for the greatest number, then they were bad laws. Ultimately, this, what he called principle of utility, should be applied to any law that was passed and applied to any law that had already been passed to see if it should be revoked. Bentham will sort of sponsor a new movement in the British Parliament that will focus on using utilitarianism when it comes to governing. And ultimately, this will foster a new movement in Great Britain with slow and steady reforms being enacted in the government over time. Ultimately, we refer to this process as evolutionary liberalism. Another individual who was a compatriot of Jeremy Bentham but lived a little bit after Jeremy Bentham died, continuing to hold his position in Parliament, was John Stuart Mill. John Stuart Mill was a proponent of utilitarianism, but he also felt that there were in some cases, utilitarianism did not go far enough to promote, quote, the greatest good for the greatest number. As a matter of fact, John Stuart Mill was very much influenced by the women's suffrage movement that was going on in Great Britain and in America at this particular time. He became a proponent for what was called universal suffrage, meaning everyone of age should have the vote. And he included in that women as well. He believed that women should be educated, and if they were educated, they could become better citizens, better informed citizens, and therefore there was no reason that they could not aid in choosing who would govern the country. The last one I have listed here as a classical liberal that I want you to know is Bastiat. Bastiat was a man who, greatly influenced by the Enlightenment, was also very much reacting to some of the changes that were going on in society as industrialization occurred. We will discuss more specifically the impact of industrialization in the next lecture. But I want you to understand that Bastiat's book, The Law, published in 1850, encapsulates the classical liberalism movement. Ultimately, this book will be a counter to the socialist challenge that comes about in the 19th century. In particular, you can see Bastiat's work as the antithesis of Marx's work, the Communist Manifesto. We'll discuss more about that as we cover socialism and do more comparing and contrasting of classical liberalism and socialism at that point in time. Now, classical conservatism is the other side of the coin when it comes to classical liberalism in this early 19th century era. And classical conservatism was nothing new. It basically was what Thomas Hobbes and others like him had always been proponents of. They felt that the status quo was the best, with traditional governments under absolute monarchs. And by the time we get to the 19th century, instead of Hobbes being the standard bearer for this movement, instead the folks that became the new standard bearers were people like Edmund Burke of Great Britain and Metternich of Austria. Edmund Burke, even though he was from England that had a fairly balanced government with a constitutional monarchy at this point, he saw what had happened with the American Revolution, and he was very concerned of the implications. Once the French Revolution happened, and it became so radical, he felt that these ideals, these Enlightenment ideals, instead of promoting gradual changes like inertia, he felt that these movements had become too radical and promoted anarchy. So he reversed his ideas about some of the earlier ideals of Locke being okay, and reverted back to thinking that absolute monarchy was the only way to go, to enforce rule of law and to keep society from spinning into chaos. Now, Metternich of Austria really becomes the central figure of classical conservatism in the 19th century, largely because after the Napoleonic Wars were over, there needed to be a restoration of the balance of power in Europe. And ultimately, it came under the leadership of Austria to do this. Prince Metternich was the chief minister of Austria at the time. And so he will have a major role in reshaping what Europe will be after the Napoleonic Wars. More on him in a minute. Now, I mentioned Metternich and the ideals of classical conservatism making a comeback after the wars of Napoleon were over. In 1815, after Napoleon is finally defeated once and for all, the nations of Europe that had belonged to the European coalition, as well as the defeated power of France, came together in an international summit meeting to try to determine what to do to restore the balance of power in Europe. The balance of power had shifted too much in the favor of France during the Napoleonic Wars. And after the wars were over, after the defeat of Napoleon, boundaries needed to be redrawn. Ultimately, this summit meeting will take place in Austria, since Austria was the primary member of the European coalition against France. And it was called the Congress of Vienna. The meeting is in 1815 in Vienna, Austria. Now, Metternich, as I said before, was a staunch conservative. He believed that absolute monarchy was the best kind of government, was the only kind of government that could keep society from spinning into anarchy. And he wanted to restore absolute ideals of government all over Europe, where things had gone topsy-turvy during the French Revolution and the wars of Napoleon. When it came to how Metternich viewed society and humanity, he looked at society as if it was an organism. And just like other living organisms, there were certain parts of society that were more important than other parts. Look at the human body as an example. The pinky finger is not as important of a part of the organism known as the human body as, say, the head. If you chop off a pinky finger, you'll probably survive. But if you chop off your head, you will not. Metternich looked at the monarchy and the absolute power of a monarchy as the most important thing in this living organism of society. You cannot do without it. But the peasantry, the middle class, the commoners, the little people, they were more like pinky fingers, whereas the kings were more like the head. So he wanted to restore this notion of conservatism back to the majority of the European countries. And since so many countries ended up losing territory to Napoleon during those wars, they all were more inclined to feel the same way after the wars were over, wanting their territories back, wanting maybe some more territories, and wanting to restore order primarily above everything else. Ultimately, at the Congress of Vienna, the ideals of liberalism and the new ideal of nationalism, which we'll talk more about in a moment, were things that these conservatives were increasingly worried about. They worried about the spread of liberal ideals, which were the Enlightenment ideals, as well as the spread of nationalism. Nationalism being something where a group of individuals sees themselves as different than others around them and wanting to create their own identity in a society, their own nation. if these ideas of nationalism and liberalism caught on again, like they had done in the French Revolution and in the Napoleonic Wars, all of Europe could be torn apart once again. So, as a kind of knee-jerk reaction to the excesses of the French Revolution and Napoleon, conservatism was restored to most of Europe at the Congress of Vienna. Even the British delegates voted for more conservative measures to be put in place, even though they came from a constitutional monarchy. Metternich was able to influence the other delegates from the other nations that came to the Congress of Vienna, largely because he convinced them through logic that absolutism was imperative, and also he wined and dined them and won them over in that way as well. Ultimately, what we will see happen after the Congress of Vienna, where power was restored to the monarchs of Europe and stability was once again restored, we will also see a international organization called the Concert of Europe established as well. The Concert of Europe ultimately was an international organization whose role was to maintain the balance of power in Europe, and if anything threatened that balance of power, the members of the Concert of Europe would send military troops in to put down those movements. Any movements based on classical liberalism, aka Enlightenment ideals, or nationalism would be squashed by the Concert of Europe. And it went on this way from 1815 to 1848. That's why we refer to this time period, the post-Napoleonic age, as the Age of Metternich. It's also sometimes called the Age of Conservatism. It only lasts until 1848 because by that point the repression of the Concert of Europe trying to keep a cap on liberal and national movements throughout Europe created a kind of backlash to it. If you think about the Concert of Europe and the repression of these movements as a kind of pressure cooker in Europe, you might understand what happens in 1848. A pressure cooker, if you will, is a utensil in the kitchen that you can cook things fairly quickly because it creates pressure, steam. It uses steam, and under pressure it cooks things very quickly. Many of you may be familiar with a pressure cooker from growing up. Your mom might have had a pressure cooker. And ultimately, there's a little release valve on the top of the pressure cooker, the locking lid, which creates that pressure. There's a release valve that would release the steam every now and then, so you wouldn't have too much pressure buildup and an explosion. Look at the Concert of Europe as a pressure cooker. The conservative repression that they enforced on the different populations all over Europe that were trying to fight for nationalist causes or liberal causes. Ultimately, the Concert of Europe did not have a release valve for some of that steam, for some of that pressure. And in 1848, there was an explosion. And the release will happen in the form of many small but deadly revolutions all over Europe, known as the 1848 revolutions. More on that later. Now we need to talk about the rise of nationalism and the impact it will have on unification movements in Europe after the Age of Metternich is over. Nationalism was a byproduct of the Revolutionary Age and the Napoleonic Wars, in spite of the repression of the Concert of Europe that was established at the Congress of Vienna. We'll discuss this as we move forward in this lecture. So what exactly is nationalism? Nationalism is not always easy to define. Ultimately, you need to understand that sometimes nationalism is based on reason and logical principles, but oftentimes it can also be based on a great deal of emotional responses to things. It's not always rational. The basic thing you need to understand about nationalism, though, is that community is key. Ultimately, it's when a group, a community, distinguishes themselves as a group with commonalities, with some kind of commonalities. And those commonalities can be a number of different things. Sometimes it's a group that has a similar religious ideology, or all speak the same language, or have some kind of cultural heritage that they share. Ultimately, these communities, these nationalistic communities, believe that the government that would rule over them should reflect and promote the interests of that community. Sometimes this will happen through conflict with other peoples. This is called national self-determination, which is another byproduct of the Age of Reason ultimately. Sometimes national self-determination leads to conflicts. For example, the American Revolution and the French Revolution. Nationalism was a part of both of those movements. The Enlightenment ideals, coming from the Age of Reason, helped to foster the nationalist ideals of the Americans as well as the French. Thomas Paine's work, that you've read, Common Sense, is a great nationalist pamphlet, if you will, that was used to help promote nationalism in the minds of the colonists living under the British Empire in North America. And it worked. Now, another thing you need to understand about nationalism is there are, good things and bad things about nationalism. Some of the good things are things that we like to think of today, like patriotism and pride in your country. But sometimes nationalism can promote an us and them mentality. It can lead to a mistrust of minority groups, ones that do not fit in the mold of the nationalist group that sees themselves as similar. This mistrust of minorities in many states in Europe will ultimately lead to some more problems throughout the 19th and 20th centuries. A perfect example of this is the rise of anti-Semitism. As nationalism grows in Europe, despite the conservative repression of the Concert of Europe, we see this us and them mentality manifest itself first against the Jews. The them in Europe were the Jews, who were living outside of the Christian majority in Europe. Now, yes, there were different kinds of Christians. There were Catholic Christians. There were many different kinds of Protestant Christians. But they were all Christian, whereas the Jews were seen as the outsiders living amongst them. And there were Jews in every single European nation. The rise of anti-Semitism can be best explained and how it can get out of control in the 19th century by looking at the Dreyfus Affair. Of course, it gets even more problematic as we move into the 20th century with World War II and the Nazi regime, but we haven't gotten there yet. But looking at the Dreyfus Affair that happens in France between 1894 and 1906, we can see this us and them mentality. Dreyfus was the first Jew in France to reach the rank of general in the French military. And this was, of course, a byproduct of the changes that came about because of the French Revolution, promotion by merit within the army. In the 1800s, late 1800s. It was discovered that military secrets, French military secrets, were leaking out to their enemies, in particular the Germans. And a witch hunt began to determine who was responsible for the leaking of these military secrets. It had to be somebody in the highest ranks of the military. And ultimately, the blame was put on Alfred Dreyfus. There was absolutely no physical evidence against him that could be found. Ultimately, he was accused and he was found guilty of treason primarily because he was a Jew. He was scapegoated because of that. He would be sent to Devil's Island, which was a French penal colony. The military secrets continued to leak, verifying that he was not the culprit. Finally, when the culprit came forward, Dreyfus was brought back and he was tried, this time as a conspirator. They still believed that he had to have something to do with it. And he was found guilty once again and sent back to Devil's Island. Ultimately, it will not be until 12 years later, 1906, that Dreyfus is finally pardoned and set free. But this led to a lot of us and them mentality in France at the time. And ultimately, with the treatment of Dreyfus in France, this will lead to the rise of Zionism in response. Zionism was a movement that actually happened all throughout Europe, and the whole point of Zionism, which was Jewish nationalism, it was the seeking of a national homeland for Europe's Jews in Palestine. Now, there was no state of Israel at this point. The Jews lived all over Europe. They had been living all over Europe since they were dispersed and exiled out of their homeland by the Romans during the Roman Empire. And so nationalism was Zionism was a Jewish nationalist movement which was seeking to create a homeland for the Jews in Palestine. This would not happen overnight. As a matter of fact, it will not happen until after World War II is over and the Holocaust. In 1948, the United Nations will create the State of Israel. But what ultimately happens is this Zionism will clash with the nationalist Palestinian Arabs living in the region, and this struggle will continue till this very day. The present day, we still see the antagonisms between the different groups in this region, and it does not seem that there will be any real solution to this problem anytime soon. So this us and them mentality is a byproduct of nationalism that oftentimes can lead to violence and scapegoating against minorities. Now, I mentioned that the Age of Metternich started with the Congress of Vienna in 1815, when monarchies were restored all over Europe. The boundaries were redrawn for Europe to reestablish the balance of power, and the Concert of Europe was put in charge of maintaining that balance of power and maintaining order. That will last until 1848, when the pressure cooker explodes and we have revolutions based on nationalism all over Europe. And ultimately, we need to recognize how this came about and why it seemed to spread so quickly. Ultimately, we will see these 1848 revolutions act like a virus. In some cases, the 1848 revolutions are known as the virus, the 1848 virus, revolutionary virus. The first of the rebellions begins in France, of course, but then other nationalist groups throughout Europe in different territories, in the German principalities, for example, as well as in the Austrian Empire, will see what happened in France and will react and push for independence themselves in the creation of their own nation states. So I'm going to talk a little bit about each of these. France. Now, the last time we talked about France, we were talking about how Napoleon had been defeated, and I mentioned that instead of undoing everything that the French Revolution had accomplished, at the negotiations of the Congress of Vienna, France was allowed to have a restoration of monarchy. Yes, the Bourbon family was restored to the throne. The brother of Louis XVI, who had been living abroad, was restored to the throne, but he will rule as a constitutional monarch. The National Assembly will continue to be the legislative body of France, and they will work hand in hand with Louis XVIII. That's the number that he takes. He never takes the number 17 because of kind of as homage to his nephew who never was king, who died in prison during the Revolution. So now he was a constitutional monarch. There were still elections, for the legislature. It seemed as if at least the moderate phase of the French Revolution was able to accomplish some real reforms in French politics. So why is there a revolution in 1848? A lot of it had to do with economic problems once again. There were a series of bad harvests once again, and that led to an increase in prices in many things, including basic foodstuffs. Oftentimes when the economy starts to falter, people naturally blame the government for not doing enough to fix the problem. Does this sound familiar to anyone? Anyhow, the point being, the reaction was that the king had not done enough to help the issue, and it ended in rebellion. Ultimately, at the end of the 1848 revolutions, not just in France, but in other places that follow after France, we ultimately have a problem. The revolutionaries would be successful in ousting the conservative regimes that had been put in place at the Congress of Vienna initially. But the problem was these revolutionaries did not have any plan for what to do next. They knew they wanted to revolt, but they didn't have a plan for what they should have in place of the government that they overthrew. And ultimately, that allowed for the conservative regimes that were caught off guard in 1848 and maybe were quickly deposed. It gave them a chance to adjust and to come back and divide the revolutionaries and conquer and reestablish themselves in power. So in some cases, the revolutions of 1848 come full circle and end up with the conservative monarchs back in control. In some cases, it's a different monarch or a different government, but it is definitely not the nationalist government that the original revolutionaries had intended upon. For example, France ends up with another Bonaparte on the throne. He will be known as, his name was Louis Napoleon. He was a nephew of the original Napoleon Bonaparte. But he ultimately takes the title Emperor Napoleon III. And once again, France has an emperor. Now, he will not be able to conquer all of Europe like his uncle had done, but France goes from having a constitutional monarchy to having an emperor once again by the end of 1848. So they were, in many cases, less free than they had been at the beginning. In the German principalities, we see a similar thing happening. German nationalism, there was no united Germany at this point in 1848, but there were movements among many middle-class intellectuals throughout the different German principalities who wanted to form a German nation, one German nation. These German nationalists were pushing for the creation of a German nation based on classical liberal principles, creating a constitutional kind of government, whether it be a constitutional monarchy or some kind of republic, depending on which national you asked. Ultimately, it led to rebellion all throughout the different German principalities. But ultimately what we see happen is one of the most significant of the German principalities was Prussia. Prussia was under the leadership of a staunchly conservative absolute monarch, Frederick William, and he ultimately will respond by first giving lip service to the revolutionaries, telling the German nationals to come to Frankfurt to have a meeting to try to determine what kind of new government they want. So they do, and they decide that they will create this German nation, and they will offer Frederick William, who was the king of Prussia, the crown to be king of a united Germany. But instead of being an absolute monarch like he was in Prussia, he would be a constitutional monarch, and his power would be limited by an elected German legislature. Frederick William did not want anything to do with that. Ultimately, he responds by saying, "I will not accept a crown out of the gutter." He sends his royal troops in, and he disperses the nationalists, and ultimately all of the rebellions that were going on in the German principalities will fail. And there will be no German Union at this time, and there will continue to be conservative regimes in power. In Austria, we see what happens to a polyglot empire when nationalism sets in. This is one of the reasons why Metternich and his boss, the Emperor of Austria, were so concerned about the spread of nationalism. Austria was a polyglot empire. Polyglot means that it is multinational, multi-ethnic, even multi-languages, multi-languaged in the throughout the empire. It was an empire, not a kingdom. They had conquered territories in southeastern Europe, bringing it under the umbrella of the Austrian Empire. Now, if nationalism sets in some of these areas that don't speak German or that have a different religion, not Roman Catholicism, instead maybe Eastern Orthodoxy or what have you, if nationalism settles in any of these areas, the Austrian Empire, which is basically sewn together, this polyglot empire, it could completely unravel. And that's exactly what starts to happen with the revolutions of 1848. This was Metternich's worst fear. This was the emperor's worst fear. But ultimately, at the end of the rebellions in the Austrian Empire, the revolutionaries will fail to achieve their independence, and order will be restored by the emperor in Austria. Some of the areas that rebelled were Hungary itself, wanting independence from this Austro-Hungarian Empire. We also saw rebellions in northern Italy. There were portions of northern Italy that were part of the Austrian Empire. And some areas in Bohemia, the Czech nationals wanting their independence. Ultimately, like I said, the Austrian Emperor was able to restore his conservative power in those areas and to squash the rebellion. Even though these revolutions of 1848 failed, it showed all of Europe that nationalism was something that was going to have to be reckoned with, that this was not going to go away quietly like they had hoped after the Napoleonic Wars, and it was something that was here to stay, that was going to have to be dealt with. After the failure of the 1848 revolutions, based on a mixture of nationalism with a lot of Enlightenment ideals or classical liberal ideals, many of the nationalists recognize that they may have to take a different approach if they are going to achieve their nationalist movements. And we see this manifest itself, these different kinds of tactics manifest themselves in some unification movements that come about in the mid-19th century after the 1848 revolutions. One was in Italy. Now, I mentioned in a previous lecture that there was no United Kingdom of Italy. Italy, as a matter of fact, had not been united as one since it had been part of the Roman Empire. The 1848 revolutions, especially those northern Italian provinces that tried to wrench themselves free of Austrian control, ultimately will foster Italian nationalism in many of those principalities and city-states in Italy. One of these individuals was Giuseppe Mazzini. He was an individual who had promoted the idea of creating an Italian nation-state, especially after the failure of the 1848 revolutions. He's a newspaper editor, and he has a great deal of influence as a newspaper editor. And so he will be kind of the, I guess you would say, the grandfather of the Italian nationalist movement. Ultimately, we will see, as Mazzini passes away, the Italian nationalism will be passed on to come under the leadership of an individual named Camillo Cavour. Now, Cavour will not do this alone. He has some help as well with Giuseppe Garibaldi. These two together could be looked at as the architects of the Italian unification movement and the creation of the nation-state of Italy. How does this happen? Camillo Cavour was the prime minister from the Kingdom of Piedmont. Piedmont was an area that had created their own kind of constitutional government. It actually was a constitutional monarchy. It was one of the Italian principalities. And they had created their own constitutional monarchy, and he was the chief minister or prime minister of that nation. He was the head of the legislature of that nation. Having been influenced by Mazzini, he will eventually launch a movement to create an Italian nation. But instead of just using idealism from the Enlightenment, from the classical liberals, he recognizes the need to be shrewd, to look at the situation for what it was and be pragmatic. Ultimately, he will use alliances as well as warfare, making deals. Sometimes they are secret deals, and using warfare in certain ways in order to make unification happen. This is known as realpolitik. Some would say it's very much like the old Italian Machiavelli had argued in his book, The Prince. The end justifies the means. Sometimes you need to do some unsavory things if the end goal is ultimately met. So what Cavour will do is he will use alliances and warfare, especially warfare against Austria, to obtain a unified Italian nation, using his Kingdom of Piedmont as the nucleus that had its own liberal government, but recognizing that he may need to use warfare and backroom deals in order to achieve it. In particular, he courted an alliance with France. France was the natural enemy of Austria ever since the French Revolution. And by getting France's help, he was able to finally free those northern Italian provinces that had been under the Austrian Empire. And then Cavour convinced Giuseppe Garibaldi, living in the southern part of Italy in the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies, to launch a nationalist movement there, They will rebel against the king in the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies, and eventually they will join together with the northern states that had joined with Piedmont to form the Kingdom of Italy in 1861. 1861, the Kingdom of Italy is declared, and the former king of Piedmont, Victor Emmanuel I, will be the new king. He is a constitutional monarch. They will start having elections for the new Italian parliament the following year. The holdouts to joining in this unification movement were the Papal States and Venice. But by 1866, they were also added into the mix. The use of warfare to achieve the goal of unification ultimately worked. Realpolitik. What did the French get in exchange for their support of the Italians fighting against the Austrians? They obtained Nice, France, which was a port on the Mediterranean, which was extremely lucrative for France, ultimately. Now, in comparison, in the 1860s, we also have finally the creation of a united Germany, much like we see happening in Italy. But it will have a little bit of a different flavor to it. Italy does use realpolitik, the politics of reality, and sometimes having to use warfare and using backroom deals, etc., to get the job done. But ultimately, Italy did go back and have a classically liberal-based government in the constitutional monarchy that they established. This was primarily because the nucleus of Piedmont, around which the Italian unification movement happened, that was a classically liberal government already. The nucleus for German unification in the 1860s, though, is the classically conservative Prussia under an absolute monarch. And ultimately, even though the German unification will be centered around the use of warfare and making deals, the government that they create at the end with this unified Germany will be a more conservative regime with no constitutional kind of principles, at least not based on classical liberalism. Instead, it will be a more staunchly conservative regime. German unification really happens because of the Prussian chancellor, which is kind of like a prime minister, under the leadership of the King of Prussia. The King of Prussia at this point was William I, but Otto von Bismarck was his chancellor. And Bismarck ultimately recognized the power of the German nationalist movement, which, worked to try to achieve the creation of a German nation in 1848, but failed. This time what he will do is he will take on German nationalism, but he will mix it with his conservative political goals. Ultimately, the German nationals that wanted to create a more constitutionally liberal type of government their thunder is stolen away from them as German nationalism becomes a conservative cause instead of a liberal cause. Bismarck will utilize realpolitik, the use of raw power, warfare, and deceit to accomplish the goal of German unification. And he does this with a series of wars. Bismarck actually had these wars planned out, how they would play out, before he even began the process. Ultimately, it's centered around Prussia and gaining more power for Prussia, which will be the nucleus to create the new German Empire. First, they needed to gain access to the areas along the Baltic and North Seas. These territories that had belonged to Denmark needed to be acquired and added to Prussia. And so in 1864, Bismarck um, made an alliance, an agreement with the Austrians that if the Austrians came and helped the Prussians defeat the Danish to get these territories, if you look on the map, Schleswig and Holstein were territories, and Mecklenburg were territories that they were acquiring from Denmark. If they received help from Austria, Austria would receive some of these territories. Now, Austria did not have any territories in the Baltic, so they thought that this would be good. This would be another port that they would have access to. So ultimately, Austria supports Prussia's war against the Danes in 1864, and they defeat the Danish pretty handily. The Danish had not been to war in many, many generations. They were caught off guard completely. And yes, the territory of Mecklenburg was ceded to Austria. Now, Bismarck never intended on allowing Austria to maintain that territory. Instead, he knew that he would attack them next. But again, he gets the support of the natural enemy of Austria, France, to do this. Now, some of the reasons why he makes these alliances is so he doesn't look like an aggressor in the name of William I. Remember, he is just the chancellor. William I is the actual king. But he doesn't want to look like the aggressor, and he doesn't want the consort of Europe to come in and get involved, since this is ultimately shifting the balance of power in Europe around. If he has more than one of the members of the consort of Europe on his side, then he can perhaps keep them out of the equation. And so, ultimately, he will foster a relationship with France under Napoleon III, and he will attack Austria in 1866 to gain back that territory of Mecklenburg, as well as some other territories. The Austrians were caught completely off guard. They were just allies, and now the Prussians are attacking them. What is going on? This was Bismarck's plan. Whoever is his ally in the previous war becomes his target in the next war. And so you can kind of see where this is going. After the Austrian War, there will be yet one more war in order to get these southern Germanic provinces to join in with the northern provinces that had basically unified with Prussia. He will foster another war with France. France had a close trade relationship with these southern German principalities. They also shared a common religion of Roman Catholicism. The southern parts of the German principalities had remained primarily Catholic, whereas those northern German principalities had become Lutheran, had become Protestant. So ultimately, those southern provinces, having this relationship with France, this trade relationship with France, were not really wanting to join with the northern provinces, worrying that they would be overshadowed in their economic activity with France, and other reasons as well. So how is Bismarck going to get this to happen? Well, he needs to look, again, like he is not the aggressor, like Prussia is not the aggressor. He needs to somehow get France to declare war on Prussia, so Prussia looks as if they're defending themselves, and then, of course, the southern German provinces may see France as the aggressor and not wanting them to get involved in that, ultimately maybe convinced that they would be stronger if they joined with northern Germany than if they maintained this relationship with France. There's a lot more details that go into this, but in a nutshell, and for our purposes in a survey course, it's important that you know that ultimately Bismarck was able to use deceit in order to get France to declare war on Prussia in 1871, launching the Franco-Prussian War. He lies in the Ems telegram. You can look into more details about that in your textbook. but ultimately he insults the French, and he gets Emperor Napoleon III to declare war on him first. Now he looks as if Prussia is just defending itself. The southern German principalities ultimately were found it prudent to join with Prussia rather than stay on the side of France at the end of this war, where France was utterly defeated by the Prussians. And so in 1871, after the Franco-Prussian War is over, the Empire of Germany will be announced. The Empire of Germany, also known as the Second Reich, will be an authoritarian regime under the kingship of William I, Wilhelm I. He will be the Kaiser king of a greater Germany. Germany is united as one, finally. Now, with the unification of Italy and the unification of Germany, obviously the balance of power in Europe that had been established back in 1815 with the Congress of Vienna is completely topsy-turvy. We have two new big power nations that have taken territories from other nations, and the map looks completely different. The European map looks completely different than it did in 1815. These two nations of Italy and Germany will ultimately become big power states as we move closer to the 20th century. And both of them will have a dominant role, especially Germany, as we move into the scramble for more territories with a new movement of imperialism, as well as World War I. More on that in a later lecture.